Great. Dr. Horton received her Bachelor's of Science in Zoology from the University of Washington and her PhD in Biology from the University of Utah. She's currently an Associate Professor of Research in the Department of Anthropology at Northwestern University, subfield Biological Anthropology. As a human biologist, she combines principles of biological anthropology, ecology, evolution, and physiology to investigate the mechanisms by which environmental conditions alter physiology and mental health. More generally, she applies her work to help generate public understanding of the reciprocal relationship between human and planetary health with the goal of affecting public policy and programs. I'm so happy you're here to talk with us about this. This is, a typical thing that I always, seek is being able to sort of quantify or describe more, effectively the benefit of
Mhm.
nature. So thank you for joining us. And if you can share screen, we'll.
Sure. Well, thank you. Let me get in here. This is always a challenge, it seems like, no matter how many times we do it. Let me start the slideshow. Okay. Now, if this worked, you are seeing the
Perfect.
presentation, but not my
Sure.
notes, so you don't get the preview of coming attractions.
That's correct. And I just should do a tiny bit of housekeeping. We're going to keep people's videos off for the recording because this is recording. And also, if you have questions, if you could submit them in the chat, we would like to hold them to the end and then address them there. So I'm going to turn myself off.
Okay, I think I have managed to move my toolbar out of the way so that I can actually see what I'm doing. So thank you, Leslie, for inviting me to give this talk. It's really great to be chatting with some old friends. I saw some names coming on that I recognize and um, love the work that Natural Habitat Evanston has been doing. And I hope that what I'm going to present will help you further your work. And always, even though Larry and I have moved up to Minnesota, I'm only a phone call or an email away. I'm still gainfully employed at Northwestern University, so feel free to reach out whenever you want. Um, so thank you to all of you who are in the audience for taking time to spend with us. So here's what I plan to do for this evening. My goals are to introduce the concept of planetary health and then talk a little bit about my work and how I came to do what I do. And I'm going to do that by kind of giving a very, yeah, 35,000 foot overview of the research that we do and kind of talk about the question that I often get from especially activists and people who want to see action taken. They say, well, why do we need to do research? Don't we already know that? I want to give you a few examples of what we do know, what we don't know, and why we need to know more. And that feeds into the idea of why original research and data matter for people who are trying to develop policy and programs, and then talk about how we can really use this information to help make change, because it seems that it's very slow to have things happen and change. So as I start, I want to acknowledge that the Northwestern University sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Odawa, as well as Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. And similarly, the land that we are on, and I just lost my cursor. Okay, there we go. Um, on has been inhabited by humans for over 14,000 years. And in recognition of these ancestral connections, I want to remind us of the different worldviews held by different peoples, especially the importance of the concept of reciprocity between humans and nature. Okay. Um, so in keeping with the theme of planetary health, let us think about humans being a part of nature Indigenous peoples and Western peoples prior to the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution held a worldview that includes humans as being embedded within or as a part of nature rather than being separate from this. Um, so this places humans as part of the biosphere and the ecosystems. The mindset of reciprocity contributes to the scientific approach known as planetary health. And it's this framework of planetary health that frames my research and the work I do. So, what is planetary health? Planetary health is a field of research and practice that is focused on the interconnections between human health and Earth's natural systems. And in simple terms, planetary health asks, how can humans thrive while ensuring the planet thrives too? And I want to emphasize that planetary health is more than just global warming or climate change. There are many things that are included. And as we have faced the escalation of human pressure on the global environment, we're seeing changes, in the climate, of course, but also ozone depletion, deforestation, land degradation, wetland loss, biodiversity loss, the depletion of fresh water and its contamination, and the many effects of urbanization and the damage to coastal reefs and ecosystems. However, within all of this, I just want to give some examples of how these climate or these planetary changes influence human health and well-being. For example, increased exposure to air pollution and extreme flooding and heat have severe effects on humans' mental and physical health. Think about the number of asthma cases, the impact of black mold from flooding, and the horrible number of deaths that are caused from extreme heat. More people die from extreme heat than any other weather-related event. These, especially extreme heat, it exacerbates people with existing vulnerable health conditions and increases health-related illnesses and death, and also results in exposure to novel pathogens as insect vectors and other things migrate with climate change. The other thing that we see happening are impacts on mental health, such as the increases in stress and anxiety associated with extreme weather events, natural disasters, and traumatic events associated with these changes. So a little bit more about me is that I came from an intellectual tradition that is based in comparative ecology and physiology and ecological physiology. This means I'm interested not only in how animals work, but why they work that way. And I think of ecology, or you can think of ecology as the play or the stage on which the play of life occurs, whereas evolution is the actual play and the theater, and you have to understand the history of how the characters got here and where they're going. But as a result of this diverse training in physiology and ecology and evolution, on a practical side, it means I can measure your cortisol levels and set a trap line or run a transect to look for biodiversity levels at the same time. So it gives me a very diverse perspective. So what this lets me do, and at about 2014, as I was starting to kind of get burned out on working on strictly rodent models in the laboratory and wanted to get more back to my roots of understanding how we live and how we can live more compatibly with nature, I wanted to link what I'd been doing in the lab, studying regulation, hormonal regulation of reproduction and metabolism in rodent models, to directly contribute to helping others understand how conserving nature is important to human health. And this means doing research that examines, excuse me, the mechanisms connecting human health to engagement with nature. And that is something that my training allowed me to do. And so using my training, I was able to develop a model that links pathways from the external environment using, all of our sensory systems of taste, the inhalation of air and whatever chemicals that contains through our respiratory system, and the foods and things we ingest through our digestive system, because all of these things get processed in our body to influence our endocrine and immune systems, our autonomic nervous system, and our cognitive centers in our brain. And it is the impact of these physiological systems that influence our health and well-being. And so using this model, I can develop a framework or use this as a framework for designing experiments that examine the causal relationships between nature exposure and human health. And this is the type of information that policymakers, especially health policymakers, need in order to justify incorporating aspects of nature into policy. So when I began this work back in 2014, and I'm a science geek, so the first thing I asked is, how good is the evidence? How strong is the evidence? And back in 2014, the field was really in its infancy, and the data weren't very good. Matter of fact, there were about 346 papers total from about 1972 to 2014 on the mental health effects of engaging with nature, and only 39 papers, at least in this particular literature search. I did a more extensive literature search, but this is an example just so you can see kind of what the relative numbers were. And the other thing is the quality of this work was not very great, because at that time there was a very strong reliance on subjective data, self-reported data, and things that were not well controlled, and what we wouldn't think of as experimental data. However, since 2014, things are improving very rapidly. And the last time I did this exercise in terms of seeing how fast the field was growing was in about 2023. And both the quality and the quantity of research was increasing. And so that, by early 2023, we were looking about one paper a day being published per year. And that, I think that bodes well. The other thing is, about that time, we finally had a textbook on the health benefits of nature in public health. And I figure by the time somebody writes a textbook, we're really on a roll and we're going someplace with this. So what I want to emphasize, building in on this question of, why do we need more research? Isn't there enough by now? How many of those papers do we need? Is that for policymakers to be able to use the data, the work we provide them needs to meet strict standards, because they're tied to what is considered sound science guidelines, which, depending on which agency you're working with, can be very restrictive as to what can actually be used. Some agencies only allow you to use data that are more younger than 10 years old. Some have restrictions on how large the sample size has to be. But there's some general guidelines for solid science and its foundation as useful data. Meaning we've got to be really clear on our methodology and explain what was done. We need to use objective measures. Sometimes there are times when subjective or self-reported measures or more qualitative data are very useful, but we've got to be able to pair that with objective measures of take at least some of the personal bias out of this. Longitudinal studies that can help show causality really bump up in the scale of what is really useful. Of course, we want to minimize bias. We want to have as large a sample size as possible, and preferably from multiple studies looking at similar or using similar methods so that we can ensure replicability and that this is generalizable to large numbers and it's not just some little unique thing that applies to one small group of people. It's got to be analyzed very rigorously with statistics. It needs to be reproducible. It needs to survive the rigors of peer review. And then over time, with this reproducibility and with replication, we build a consensus. And that's where, when we think about numbers of papers mattering, it's in this process of building consensus. Because sometimes somebody's going to get one answer, sometimes somebody's going to get another answer, and we need to be able to explain why there are these differences. So what I want to talk about a little bit today is some of my own work, and this is going to be, again, a very, very brief overview. I'm not going into all the projects I've worked with. I'm not going into any detail at all on any particular study. But I want to use these examples of kind of how data can contribute and how original research can contribute to helping provide some of those sound scientific principles needed to build good policy. And so, I've worked on projects such as the GROW project, which looks at the role of gardening and engagement in substance use recovery, substance abuse recovery. We've done some surveys looking at how people relied on engaging with nature to deal with the stresses of COVID. One of the big projects I'm working on that takes a lot of time, and I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but I'm happy to answer some questions, is diffusing disasters. You can just Google diffusing disasters, Northwestern University. This is being done in collaboration with the city of Chicago and community members, and the real driving force are climate scientists at Northwestern looking at how heat impacts communities in the city of Chicago. But the things I'm going to talk about today are a study that we've recently completed in Detroit called the Study of Active Neighborhoods in Detroit, and an ongoing project that's really, at this point now, two different projects. It's the Walking Outdoors Novel Diabetes Environmental Research, which is, the acronym is WONDER. I'm going to refer to it by its previous avatar of being Walking Green, which were the pilot studies that allowed us to get NIH, or National Institutes of Health, funding to do the full-fledged WONDER study. And then at the end, and that's why it's in a little dotted line, I'm going to give a nod to something that's not a research activity. It's an engagement activity called the Nature, Culture, and Human Health Network. So the STAND study was a really novel study. As far as we know, it's the first of its kind, where we used my colleague Amber Pearson, who is a health geographer at Michigan State University, conceived this and created a multidisciplinary team of people to work together to look at the impacts of ecological park restoration on the health of people who lived in surrounding neighborhoods in Detroit. We call this a natural experiment, not because it took place in nature, but because the actual park restoration was undertaken by the Detroit Audubon Society, and we as scientists had nothing to do with the design of the implementation. What we did was design an experiment around this restoration project to look at how much physical activity people were getting in the neighborhoods. We had them wearing activity monitors. We had them wearing GPS units. We had them coming in for clinical studies to look at various health aspects. So these folks are really wired for sound. And we even had acoustic monitors, audio moths placed around all of the various parks so we could record bird song. So one of our partners on this study is an acoustic ecologist. So we can look at changes in bird diversity and link those changes in bird diversity to mental health outcomes. So there are about 11 papers published from this already, and we are currently working on the three big papers, or the splash papers, produced by this study, and so they won't be published for another 6 months or so. But we did a lot of smaller studies, in the 5 years that this project was going on, to kind of say, hey, we're here, we're doing something. And one of these things was a study. I asked, well, what I keep hearing is everybody knows, and this is the theme, is everybody knows green space improves social cohesion. Well, first of all, social cohesion is the network of connections people have in a community that helps draw a community together. And there are hundreds of papers about the role of green space and social cohesion. But as a skeptic, I wanted to know how many of those studies actually had done research and produced original data testing this relationship between green space and social cohesion. So we used a literature review, and this literature review was a project that engaged many undergraduates for multiple years. It was a continuing churn of people who I had involved with this. It was a good way to teach undergraduates about how to do research, especially literature-based research. And the theme was looking at associations among green space and social cohesion, a scoping review. So the origin of this question was a paper written by Ming Kuo, or Francis E. Kuo, and Bill Sullivan, who are both at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And they published this paper back in 1968 called Fertile Ground for Community in Inner City Neighborhoods and Common Spaces. And in this paper, they showed that people who lived in the Robert Taylor homes, where the landscape had retained the original trees and green space around it, experienced less violence, or actually perpetrators less frequently of domestic violence than people who lived in neighborhood or in the same type of buildings, in the same Robert Taylor homes that had lost their green space. So this paper, let me take that back. This paper alone, in just a very quick literature search, was cited 372 times. And the question was, in all of these citations, how many times has this relationship between green space and social cohesion been tested in original research? Are people just repeating this phenomenon that Kuo and Sullivan described without going back and actually saying, oh, does this work in other places? Does it hold? What is it about green space that fosters this social cohesion, if it does? So when you do a research paper or a review paper, there are very specific guidelines that you have to follow to make sure your search and the results are rigorous. And because doing these kinds of review papers themselves constitutes research. And so we used a format called the PRISM, or the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, for a scoping review, which means we were trying to analyze each and every paper in detail as to how perfect it was. We were just trying to see, did they do this? And so out of this, we searched 3 different databases. So these are electronic databases that index all of the scientific papers that or most of the scientific papers that are published each year. And this includes the Web of Science, PubMed, and one called PsycInfo. And we used the same search string to search all of these databases And the search string we used came about after lots of um, trial and error and using different combinations to find which ones were the most efficient search strings to try to, return things that were relevant to our study. And we had specified very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria for what could be included in our final results. As a result of this, yes, there are a heck of a lot of papers published out there that talk about this concept. We had over 1,200 papers. But after we looked at the article titles, we realized that over, close to all of them, 1,176 of them could be excluded just by looking at the titles, and they weren't really relevant to this issue of looking for original research. So of that, we were left with 78 papers that we actually retrieved the full text for each of the articles. We couldn't retrieve some, but going through this, what we ended up with finally at the bottom with 19 papers, only 19 papers out of over 1,200 that actually provided original research that examined this concept. So one of the things we wanted to know was how did these papers measure green space? Because one of the other projects we're working on is, what are the best ways to measure green space? So out of these, 6 of the papers used only subjective, which are essentially asking people, what do you think about how much green space you have access to? Some used objective measures such as satellite-derived indices or some measurement of how far people lived from a park. And 4 papers used only objective measures. But so again, there were very few people or very few studies that actually look at the data. So we don't know as much as what we think about. And we certainly don't know what it is about green space that contributes to social cohesion, because virtually all of these papers use different methods of measuring green space. So we have no idea. So this is a fertile area for research. And if you're going to try to design policy, what are we going to tell a policymaker or an urban planner about how they need to plan their green space to improve social cohesion? We don't know. So the other everyone knows is that green space improves mental health and physical health. And where an issue comes in here is how much of this work is correlational versus how much actually shows a causation between engaging with nature and improvement in health. And I want to make a distinction. I'll say it here and I will say it again. I want you to think a bit about the difference between taking a run and going out for a brisk walk or a run, and what happens to your heart rate. It goes up. Now, that's not a health outcome. If somebody says you need to be physically active to improve your health, what they're talking about is you need to get out there and be physically active for at least 150 minutes a day, and you need to do it for several weeks or months to have an impact on your cardiovascular health. That's a health outcome. So as I talk about this research, keep in mind, are we talking about just an acute response to a stimulus, or are we talking about an actual health outcome? So one of the places where we can think about health outcomes is when we look at data from epidemiological studies. So the epidemiological data is gathered by public health organizations, the CDC, governments, at all levels, to say who's healthy and why, and what's causing people to be sick. And epidemiologists are wonderful at being able to do statistics and slice and dice things to look at correlations. And many of those correlations are strong enough and repeated enough that you begin to really kind of realize there may actually be a causality here, but it's still correlational. And so much of the data on the health benefits of nature does come from epidemiological data. One of the things that intrigues me because of my research and interest in metabolism is the role of engagement with nature and reducing risk of type 2 diabetes. And that's where my current work is focusing on. Basically, what these data show is that if you live near green space, you've got about a 25% lower chance of developing type 2 diabetes. So does where you live matter? And more importantly, does where you walk matter? We all know that physical activity is very, very important to helping improve your metabolic health. So we've done a couple pilot studies, and these are the data I'm going to show from that. And these pilot studies have given us the foundation to apply to the National Institutes of Health and get funding for a 5-year study with a much larger sample size and much longer protocol to really test causality. So these studies are under the general headline of Walking Green. And the important characteristics I want to point out is these are randomized studies where we have people and their crossover designs. So we're looking at the same person over time as they spend time in natural areas or in more built and urban areas. And if you recognize these areas, this is Harms Wood and this is Old Orchard Road as our roadside walk. And so what we're looking at is the impact of the physical environment on chronic stress and its interaction with physical activity to influence lifestyle diseases. We did 2 studies, one conducted at NU and one conducted at the University of Minnesota, where I'm collaborating with people from the Department of Epidemiology. Our study at NU used primarily college students and staff from Northwestern. The mean age in our study was about 23 years, and it was evenly split between men and women with a fairly diverse race and ethnicity background. The one at the University of Minnesota had only 23 people. It was primarily female and an older age group with an average age of about 50 years. They did not report ethnicity in the published papers. I can say, knowing the study, that it was majority, white people who participated. So the work from Northwestern, one of the things we were interested in was if we send people out for walks and we have them take 3 walks in a week, can we have an impact on their blood glucose levels? And does where they walk matter? So we had people take, like I said, 3 walks of 50 minutes each. We measured their blood glucose before they started walking, and then 72 hours after they finished their 3rd walk. So we're not looking at a response to what happened to their blood glucose because they had been exercising in the moment, but whether or not that prior exercise had a long-lasting impact on their blood glucose levels. And so what we saw is that the people, and again, this is a crossover design study, so we're looking at results that are from the same people in both conditions. And we're looking at what happened before and after they did their 3 walks on the roadside and in the forest. So for the same people, when they took this walk in the forest, when we followed up with them, they had lower blood glucose levels. I mean, this was really amazing, and we were really excited about this. And so it was enough to get us an NIH grant, this and the next work I'm going to show you, which we're now looking at people. We've got a 6-week walking protocol instead of 1 walk or 1 week and 3 walks in a week. And it's still a randomized crossover study, and it's got a larger sample. We're looking for about 200 people instead of 38. So the other thing we got, and these are data from the Minnesota arm of the study, where they had heart rate monitors on people while they were walking, so we could look at an objective measure of stress. what we're looking at is heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is not how fast your heart is beating, but the precision of the rhythm with which your heart is beating. And so a low heart rate variability means is associated with higher levels of stress. Because if you think of the fight or flight response, when you're stressed, your heart needs to beat very efficiently, which means very precisely to deliver oxygen to your muscles. But when you're relaxed, your heart can be a little off the beat, so to speak. I mean, not a real arrhythmia, which would be a problem, but just a little bit more relaxed. And if you were the symphony conductor, you might be a little upset because the clarinets don't come in quite on time when they're supposed to. So what we see is that when people were walking in the green areas, their heart rate variability went up. And so the importance of doing this and why this was important to us being able to get this NIH grant that we're able to now do is it shows we can do objective measures of stress in real time as people are exposed to different environmental conditions. And this is very important, again, for that objectivity and repeatability. So we've got ways to do research. We could do the rigorous research that is needed to inform policy and program. Okay, what do you do with it? Well, the people who do policy and program use data in many ways. They use it to guide decision making about what programs to put here, whether to put a park here. They can use it to identify needs. Do we need to do this? They can decide, is this really effective? And what measurements do we need to use to determine whether this investment we're going to make in time and place and resources is going to be worthwhile? It also can inform them what are the best practices that we should use. It also ensures that the work they're doing is relevant to the problems they're trying to solve. So we've got data to suggest there are health benefits of nature. We have ways to begin or to provide the kind of objective, rigorous information, the longitudinal studies, and to show causal relationships. So one of the other big questions is there's this assumption that if you increase engagement with nature, you're going to increase environmental action. And that would be the ideal world. If what we're trying to do is improve planetary health, it'd be great. Let's go out and have people walk in the parks more, and suddenly they will become better stewards of natural resources. We need more research on that. Yeah, there are papers that show some cases that engaging with nature does that, but there are some specific caveats, like people need to understand that what they're doing actually has an impact. So we need some work on there. But when we think about planetary health, again, we need to think that human health and the health of the planet are inextricably linked, that our civilization depends on this, and we need to use natural resources wisely. However, we've known about the impact on the Earth, and specifically this example is of climate change, since the mid-1800s. That was when the greenhouse effect was first discovered. Why haven't we fixed this problem? We're still struggling to get people to fix this problem. Despite evidence, people are still arguing about it. So why don't things change? Politics. And politics is a sum up thing for cultural norms. People don't want to change because this is the way we've always done it. Economic interest, because it's going to cost more for us to do it that way. Communication, because we don't really communicate well about what needs to be done or why we're doing and why this is important. And then there's just outright misinformation or disinformation that sends people astray. So we've got to deal with why things don't change. So I'm not the only person thinking about these sorts of things, and some of you may already be aware of this, but it's a matter of kind of putting all of this stuff together in a package. Then makes me think about, okay, how do we can bring the field of two other areas of science together? One of those is the science of organizational change and wed that with planetary health. And what the field of organizational science has come up with are, well, many models, but one is this 8-point model of the steps for guiding change in organizations, from establishing a sense of urgency, creating a coalition, developing a vision strategy. These are all the things that, if we're going to affect change, we as a community and group need to be thinking about where can we come in at each of these points, and we've been doing them. But oftentimes I don't think we think about the fact that I'm doing this communication thing needs to intersect with what somebody else over here is doing. So what I'm trying to emphasize is a need for intentionality and thinking about how we can work together, and think about this as an organizational change plan proposal for planetary health. The other is a philosophy of change and approach from the field of public health. And this public health networks, or the public health field, kind of works from what I and what our similar to what our Nature, Culture, and Human Health Coalition developed, is thinking in terms of a triple aim. And that is trying to do three things at once: walk, chew gum, and rub your tummy at the same time, by influencing policy, systems, and the environment, in consistent and coherent steps for change. And so this is a way of thinking that is promoted by the Centers for Disease Control in their document of preventing chronic disease, and was articulated initially by Thomas Frieden, who wrote Hot, Flat, and Crowded, and is just very prominent in the climate change world, is a framework for public health and action. And this is a process. And this is actually, people call it PSE thinking or PSE change. It's a process. It's not a goal to change one thing. It's a policy of working together to consider what are the policies and rules that inhibit change, what are the systems that inhibit change, what are the environmental conditions that inhibit change, and working to find ways to make tweaks in all of these things that lead to better health outcomes. And for example, a more traditional way of thinking, what is called a programmatic approach, and that is you go build a program. It's let's go build a bike program where we can offer kids a bike ride for one day in the park. Or let's open and build a single community garden. That's great. We need programs, approaches, and we need people opening and maintaining community gardens. But one community garden doesn't change the world. What can change the environment and the community and have a wider effect is if you pass local ordinances that allow residents to use space for community gardens and kind of work with this PSE mindset to evoke broader change. So the bottom line of this is by uniting these ideas of organizational change with systems PSE thinking, what we've really done is pulled together the ingredients for a recipe for a social change and a social movement. And this is a framework from Nardini et al. From a paper called Consumer Psychology. It's, how do social movements grow? And what we're really talking about is a social movement. We need, I'm speaking to the choir here, I know it. We need social movements. And so this is where research scientists could fit in with community. We need to be able to communicate our work. We need to make ourselves available to provide evidence for policy work. We need to serve as expert witnesses. We need to be involved in community engaged research and bridge between communities and government. We need to provide that translational service to make that bridge. And we need to be everywhere with community for this social movement. So with that, I'm going to give my brief nod to the Nature, Culture, and Human Health Network. Some of you have heard me speak about this before. Many of you may have been involved with it. We've been quiet for a couple of years because of, as everybody else is dealing with, funding issues and staffing. But we've got some things happening in the background that we're going to leaf out again with our little silver oak leaves here, or white oak leaves. So stay tuned in the next coming months. We're back. And with that, I would like to thank my colleagues at multiple institutions, including Northwestern University, the University of Minnesota, the Oklahoma University of the Health Sciences, Michigan State University, Kansas State, a private corporation of health and technology partners, and our funding organizations. And with that, I want to say thank you for your time and attention. I'll take questions, and here's all my contact information. And I promised Leslie, this is what's in our backyard at our new home up in Minnesota.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Well,
We're
thank you.
practicing what we preach.
Yes, well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your presenting this. I gotta say, my initial feeling is overwhelmed. I gotta be honest about it because I thought of several things that we've been working on with some of the people on this call with Jerry Garl, and I think that might be Noreen Metz over there. Um,
Yeah. Hey,
and
I have a question. Should I leave the slides up or should I just stop sharing so we can just talk?
we can stop sharing if you like.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me
Um,
get over to my.
yeah.
Okay.
Hello.
I'm
Yes.
trying. There. I'm going to stop share. There we go. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, actually, what I was going to mention was the environmental justice resolution that sort of speaks to the model you were talking about policy change. But the big barrier to that is that the people who sort of conduct the public hearings and the public discussion are people in government who have there's a power imbalance and they don't really necessarily want to rethink how they have always done this. So
Hmm.
oftentimes when they're asking the question, they've really already answered this. This applies also to the one that Noreen and I have been working on, which is Mason Park, where it sort of feels like, they propose solutions. They like the solutions, turns out. And so those
Hmm.
solutions kind of got carried forward, So
Yeah.
interrupting the existing way that these things play out is pretty tough, I would say. You know.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's where what's interesting is the project I mentioned briefly, the Diffusing Disasters project, where we're working with people from the city of Chicago and things. There's a way you can go around it, is because, first of all, you have to find somebody in government who subscribes to the concept of community engaged co-governance so that they will
Right.
actually talk to community and engage with them. And um, so that's where in that particular project, we've been really lucky because everything we've done has done in conjunction with community at the table in conversations. And one of the reasons a lot of people don't like it is it's slow because you spend a lot of time in meetings talking and working with things, but there are more and more politicians and government workers, maybe not the politicians, but the staffers who recognize the need because they're not going to be effective if the data don't, or if the information doesn't come from the community. There's a saying in the disability research community that's been adopted by the racial justice community that is nothing about us without us. And this is also a mindset that needs to be changed. But I absolutely agree with you is um, when it's all coming from the top, that is one of the barriers to change.
Noreen, did you want to ask something or say something?
Uh, no, I did. Um, I was looking to see who to vote for Metropolitan Water Reclamation District.
Hmm.
And I ended up thinking that they all sounded really good, and I did not know. Anyway, I don't know what happened. I'm sure the incumbents probably got reelected. But some of them, they were talking about this project or an idea to um, to establish projects, sort of water reclamation, like in parks, and I don't know what all areas. I was just curious about it because basically they're talking about funding uh, the building of green areas just to
Hmm.
for water reclamation. So anyway,
Yeah.
thought that was
Well, I mean,
something we should like.
MWRD is I think the second largest landowner in the Chicago area after, the park, forest preserves. So yeah, it owns a ton of land.
Yeah,
But
well, and
Yeah.
they have a lot of money too.
Yeah. And I would hope, I know the Metropolitan Planning Council has people who subscribe to this community engaged mission. I'm not sure about the water reclamation, the MWRD. I would hope so. But if you talk to people in the Chicago Parks Department or anybody about green infrastructure things, there's a high failure rate with green infrastructure projects. As much as I love green infrastructure projects, and a lot of it is because it's top down. They don't get buy-in from the community. And I would hope that they will, have the roundtables and truly, honestly engage community in the discussions and planning. Because when the community feels they have ownership, and there's a distinction between having something be created by public money versus a community feeling that they have ownership of a space. They will defend it, they will clean it, they will support it. Um, and you can do amazing things with it.
So, I was thinking about that in particular when we were talking about Mason Park. I mean, it, someone could, you could organize a lot of people around uh, planting and maintaining natural areas there, but the city staff, they really don't want volunteers involved because it's easier for them to control, you know, the people underneath them. So they don't want volunteers that are, sometimes do things that they don't like.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, that's where it has to be a partnership because to a certain degree, you need to train people. And this is how many of you are familiar with the Our Roots Chicago project that is going on in the city of Chicago, the big tree planting where the um, city has a grant to plant, 50 or 70,000 trees or something like that.
yes, yes, I think they're
Um,
far along in that already. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
well,
It's been a
again,
while.
they took this community engaged approach. They have for a long time it was weekly. Now it's maybe bi-weekly or maybe only monthly meetings where community is brought in to talk about what's going on. They've developed with the Morton Arboretum and the Chicago Region's Tree Initiative, a tree ambassador program where people in the community are trained to explain to neighbors and work with them. So again, I guess my other soapbox these days is the importance of community engagement.
Hmm.
Nothing happens without community.
Hmm. I wonder, this is a kind of an arcane space, but is it better to have green space or a playground? You know, that's the other
You can
thing that
have
comes
both.
up.
Why not have both?
Well,
Why
yeah,
not have a
we might not have multiple playgrounds next to each other, So there's a
Yeah.
question of space in a limited space.
Yeah, well, it comes down to also of what your budget is. I mean, one of the reasons for the Detroit project is, and the rewilding sort of thing in Detroit was, as a post-industrial city, Detroit has a lot of vacant land
Hmm.
and no budget. Their income crashed with the hollowing out of Detroit. And they were trying to, they don't have $3 million to invest in parks all over the place. So it's a matter, part of what they were trying to do is figure out how can they deal with this space, make it attractive, make it safe, on the budget that they had. Well, and that was putting in a green space. Well, you put in the green space, you mow some paths in it. You can put in a basket. You ask community, what do the people in that neighborhood want in their park? And you have focus groups, and you have, who wants a basketball court? Who wants swing sets? What do you need to put in here? And you can, you
Yeah.
know,
We have,
yeah.
they're actually pretty good at asking, there'll be multiple rounds of community engagement. It
Mhm.
just seems like they're framing the question every time. I mean, the last meeting I went to on Mason Park
Yeah.
was what color should the playground? The only question was what color should the playground equipment be, basically.
No, 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 no. That's not the question. That's not the
And
question.
that's the consultants they hire. Well, it's the consultant, but they give them the instructions, they give them like direction, the staff does. And so
Uh-huh.
the meetings are framed how they want them to, so
Right.
it
Yeah.
point them in the direction of what they want.
Yeah.
Not, it's not
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
open-ended thing at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Now that's where
Yeah, not
we
just
need
that,
to
it's
have.
not just not open-ended, it doesn't encourage people to volunteer. And
Mhm.
there's no good, well, we do have some stewards of some of the parks in Evanston, but there's just not a good working way to involve more people in maintenance in parks,
Yeah.
which is what we really need, more people to help maintain our public spaces.
Well, we need
Hmm.
retraining. I think we need retraining of our Greensway, city staff. And they did acknowledge,
Hmm.
they have acknowledged that in their park strategies that, there does need to be, if you only know how to mow, it's like, if
Right.
you only have a hammer, everything's a nail. If you only know how to mow, everything's a lawn. So,
Right. Yeah. If you only know how to put up a swing sets, everything's a swing set. Every
right,
park's a swing set.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it sounds like, yeah, this is why things don't change. It's because it takes time and effort and um finding the right people. And I think the right people are here. But I know you've all been working really hard in Evanston already to get people's attention. I mean, the fact that Natural Habitat Evanston exists, that the Ecology Center exists, was one of the reasons I loved living in Evanston. Um, so it's a matter of now how do you leverage that to kind of shake people's tree and say, hey, you really need to talk to community.
Right.
Find the one or two people in city government who is really committed to community engaged and honest co-governance on these sorts of things. And start with one person.
Right. Well, some of them are on the call, so we definitely,
uh,
that we agree with that, and we have fantastic stewards on this call too, who, are working as hard as they can to, preserve green space and really a little bit of wildness in
Mhm.
Evanston. So, that's well. Anyway, I should wrap it up, but I
Can I
so
just step in
appreciate
here?
you.
Yeah, I
Yes, go
also,
ahead.
I just wanted to thank you so much for centering this conversation on the science. And it's really refreshing and comforting to know that this new knowledge through, rigorous research using all of the, bells and whistles to ensure, strong, sound science is being applied to these questions that will eventually create a common knowledge. It will take a long time.
Hmm.
Thank you for emphasizing that. But I think the problem that we have is the decision makers, the policy makers that, sort of make decisions about the importance of green space or what impact it will have on a particular neighborhood. They're not waiting for the research to be completed. They're not even going to read it. We really have to have
Yeah.
that ground up, that, from the ground up, as you said,
Hmm.
community engagement. When it becomes really truly embedded in our culture, then we're going
Hmm.
to see these changes happen. So I just want to thank you so much for bringing all this out in the way that you did.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you. I'm happy to be here and really wonderful. And um, Leslie has my contact information, and I'm happy to connect with anybody who has any follow-up issues.
Well, we so appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we'll let you run to the rest of your evening in your beautiful outdoors. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Night, 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 night. Take well.
Good
Thank
night.